Welcome. I'm Julie Langen, Executive Director of Future Heights, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We have a cozy crowd. We're really glad by the turnout. This event is a three-way sponsorship between Future Heights, the Cleveland Heights Historical Society, and the City of Cleveland Heights Landmarks Commission. And it's the fourth and final event in a series celebrating National Historic Preservation Month. I see familiar faces, those of you who have attended some of our previous events. They've been very popular. Last year was the first year that we did this, and we look forward to doing it again next year. In the interest of time, I know some of you are anxious to see the Cavaliers play. We want to go ahead and get right to our program. And we may still have a few people coming in, and if you notice seats around you that are still available, raise your hand and help those people find seats. We have two speakers tonight to address the topic of historic landscapes. First at the podium will be Michael Fleenor, who comes from the Cleveland Restoration Society, and he will provide an overview and talk about some of the stylistic trends popular from the probably mid-19th to early 20th century. He will be followed by Rosmarin, one of our very own landscape designers from here in Cleveland Heights, and she will be showing you some photographs of gardens typical of the periods that Michael will be describing. So without further ado, let's start off with Michael Fleenor.
Thank you. It's so good to be here with you tonight. As Julie said, I'm going to give you a very quick overview of some of the themes in landscape design during the mid-19th to the early 20th century. I'm going to talk a little bit about Victorian landscapes, although I know you don't have that many Victorian houses in Cleveland Heights. But like I said, I'm going to cover the major landscape trends, and these mostly were meaningful to people of means with larger houses, so they might not have a huge impact on some of our suburban houses. The most common landscape design of the next, please. The most common landscape design of the mid-19th century might be called Downing-esque. Downing-esque after Andrew Jackson Downing, who was known for his architectural plan books designed for public parks and opinions on domestic style. Downing was influenced by the British designer John Loudon, who published the Encyclopedia of Gardening in 1826 and founded the Gardener's Magazine of that same year. And in 1841, Downing published a treatise on the theory and practice of landscape. And he advocated, like you see in the photos here, the etchings of actual houses on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, the larger one. He advocated picturesque and naturalistic landscapes, and these highly designed lawns of curving paths, ponds, clusters of conifers, and well-placed deciduous trees were highly designed, but meant to look as if they weren't designed at all. And Loudon had, in turn, been influenced by the 18th century British designer that you may have heard of, Capability Brown, who was known for traveling on the continent, being really inspired by these romantic Roman ruins, and then drastically altering some formal, very symmetrical British gardens to make them look more, to create sort of a false natural landscape. Next, please. Although Downing preferred open lawns, most houses during this period, especially in urban areas like the Cleveland area, were fenced. And here we see another view at the top of Euclid Avenue at the end of the 19th century. The emphasis is on street trees, open lawns, and a few carefully placed conifers and deciduous trees. The bottom photos are actually both from Lakewood. I had trouble, I didn't find very many Cleveland Heights images. Next. Here are other examples of fence types and perimeter landscaping. Generally during this time period, there were no foundation plants, but rather plants used to anchor corners, delineate entrances, or frame views. So you might think of the landscape as being seen from the house rather than from the street. It was designed really to be seen from the house and to be used. Next, vines were popular because they helped to shade porches and added a bit of color. Jim McKnight's design of the volunteer garden at CRS's Sarah Benedict House illustrates the principles of urban gardens at the time. Perimeter plantings that were carefully selected, but which looked natural and not overly designed. Trees like the conifer at the corner and the weeping cherry are used to delineate the edges of the garden. Next. Prior to the mid-19th century, there had been but a few nurseries and seed houses, but this began to change. Lewis and Clark discovered new varieties of plants in their explorations, and new oriental plants became available with expanding trade with China and Japan. Suddenly, exotic plants were available in increasing numbers, and improvements in the manufacture of glass and iron made glass houses also readily available. The Victorian public was interested in specimen shrubs, weeping fruit trees, perennials with large leaves, and annuals with bright or unusual leaf colors or double blossoms. And again, it was a British designer, Humphrey Repton, who influenced changes in landscape design during this period. He kept the natural features of the lawn and lack of formal layout that Loudon had really encouraged, but he resurrected the use of flower beds and terraces near the house, and these beds were often used to spotlight exotic specimen shrubs and flowers. The plants shown here are like abutilon, which is the one in the middle that has the leaves like a maple. Canna at the top, which I don't think grows in this region. It grows down south. The fire hall that you see was from my old neighborhood in Nashville, and it was built to blend in with the neighborhood. But you see there, they have large cannas growing all around the firehouse. They had potted palms moved outside, and then these large exotic vines. Sort of illustrates the idea. And then things like amaranthus with the long purple plants. I think this is also called My Love Lights Bleeding, or it's one of those with the really odd common name. And then caladiums are popular because of their large exotic leaves. Next. Carpet beds also became popular in the late Victorian period. These ornate beds were created by planting flowers in various colors in intricate patterns. Sometimes these beds were higher in the center and contained a specimen shrub or urn. The large one you see has looks like a yucca or a palm in the middle. Other times they were planted on embankments so that you could really see all of the colors. The execution became so varied that one critic in Ladies' Home Journal decried these as pimples on nature's face because of the extremes of homeowners spelling out their initials in flowers and other design excesses that had been incorporated by corporate America. And plants that were popular for these were coleus and ageratum. Sometimes feverfew, artemisia, or dusty miller were used to delineate the sections. Next. Ornamental grasses were also popular during the Victorian period, as were urns and pots with flamboyant mixtures of cascading plants. Also, iron benches of fern fronds were popular, as was iron deer or other garden statuary. Most late Victorian homes, however, continued to have simple landscape that had more in common with the landscapes of the mid-19th century, with an open lawn, a few trees planted on the side and front and rear yards. And the invention of the lawnmower in 1830 made a trimmed and formal lawn a desirable and obtain a feature that the middle class could obtain. Next. Gertrude Jekyll was a painter who turned to garden design, and in partnership with the architect Sir Edwin Lutyens, she created many rustic country homes and gardens in Britain between the 1890s and 1930s. And Jekyll merged the natural school of garden design with the new architectural style advocated by the Queen Anne revivalist John Setting, who reintroduced formality to the garden through the use of topiaries and trellis walks. Jekyll was widely read, and her style is what we think of today really as the English cottage garden, with formal bones like hedges and boxwood borders, but a more natural selection of flowers than those exotic varieties often favored by the Victorians. And although she wasn't the designer, she often used the large pot that is pictured there, which today we often hear called the Jekyll pot. And this type of garden on a small scale was quite popular in suburban settings in the early 20th century in America. In Britain, this is really considered an arts and crafts garden. I've kind of delineated a craftsman garden as being more inspired by Gustav Stickley and the American arts and crafts movement, so I've separated that. Next. Jekyll's designs were in line with other changes in the early 20th century. Tastes changed in a way that favored simplicity. There was a reaction to the excesses of Victorian design in architecture, landscape, and furniture. Open lawns were often favored over fence lawns. And you'll see on the upper left, that's Euclid Avenue. This is probably 30 years after the etching, 40 years after the etching that you saw earlier. It looks like all the fences are gone at this point. And then East Boulevard, this photo I believe was from 1939. The neighborhood was still fairly new, maybe 30 years old, 20 years old, and there typically are very open lawns that really became part of Rockefeller Park and were inspired by the City Beautiful movement at the time. Foundation plantings also became popular in the early 20th century as foundations got somewhat higher and the typical lawn was smaller. The types of foundation plantings might be influenced by the style of the house, with colonial revival style houses having more clipped forms like a boxwood or yews, and craftsman and Tudor houses having the more natural forms like forsythia or spirea. And both of these photos are actually from East Cleveland. Hedges also became popular in place of fencing, especially on small suburban lots. And in what I'm calling the craftsman landscape, you often find the terrain less altered to accommodate the building of a house. You also find the integration of interior and exterior spaces with planters built right onto the porch, arbors and pergolas, and window boxes making the house a part of the landscape. And as mentioned earlier, hedges and shrubs here were of a more natural form, but it really fits the craftsman aesthetic and the style of architecture where the houses used, colors from nature, and they had exposed timbers and really became part of the landscape. The popularity of the colonial revival style from the 1890s on, and especially after the restoration of colonial Williamsburg in the 1920s, also influenced residential landscape design with more English-inspired, formally laid-out beds for the Georgian Revival and colonial revival style houses. And in these gardens, you'll find the boxwood is prominent. Beds are extremely formal and romanticized, very much in keeping with colonial Williamsburg. I'm not sure how historically authentic that is to colonial America, but was very influential in early 20th century suburban America. Next. And then finally, I wanted to include Italian gardens because these were used in many of your high-style houses in the 1920s in suburbs like Cleveland Heights. Many architectural styles popular in the early 20th century, such as Beaux-Arts and the Mediterranean style, etc., lent themselves well to formal Italian-style gardens of planned beds incorporating pergolas, fountains, and statuary. From the house, a balustraded terrace with stone steps often led down to a gravel path or lawn, and along the edges were shrubberies filled with evergreens and geometrically shaped flower beds, which either contain one type of plant or one color scheme. Classical fountains, statues, sundials, and plant-filled urns were also strategically placed. And the Italian garden was really the most popular in Britain up until 1870, but really only became popular in America in the early 20th century. And several of these houses are actually from Lakewood. There's obviously the Tremaine Gallagher house from Cleveland Heights. The upper house to the left is the Winton Estate, and the Glidden Estate is to the right. The house at the lower end is the Farber Morse house, which was endangered, also in Lakewood, which it was endangered about a year ago 2 years ago, a lot of the landscape features. And the next slide actually shows a couple of other historic photos of that, and the one at the bottom is the restored garden today. You may have read in the Plain Dealer, Albanian immigrant purchased that and restored it. Here to the right is the Glidden estate again. Next. And then other revival styles also incorporated landscape features unique to the style of house. After the 1920s, and really with the inspiration of colonial Williamsburg, there was a desire to really fit the landscape more to the house. Tudor and Cotswold cottages might have an English garden or a Gertrude Jekyll inspired garden. You see the Mediterranean style house with the vines, Lombardy poplars, that type of landscape feature. One of my favorite revival style houses in the city is this pagoda house, which is in North Collinwood in Cleveland. And it has pagoda style lamps as part of the gatepost. You can't see it, but there's a little red Japanese bridge that goes over the driveway. They have weeping cherries and then flowering quince as part of their landscape, which so beautifully fits that house. And then Lake Erie's on the other side. But I just wanted to conclude, though, that the most important thing, regardless of historic authenticity, is to design a landscape or design your yard in a way that is practical for you and that you enjoy. That's my presentation. Thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to say, you mentioned Hannah is something you know that you want here. Cleveland State has an enormous display of different kinds of Hannah and exotics along Gibson Avenue there in the summer.
Right. I don't think they winter here. That you have to take them in. Yes. I typically mention that during the part about Victorian landscape because I find it so fascinating that there's a beautiful Victorian garden in front of one of the more severe, brutalist style buildings at Cleveland State. I think it's their way of giving you something to look at there, but I think it's in front of their student center. You might look for that because they do use castor beans and some of those exotic cannas and some of those exotic Victorian plants. Thanks. Yes. Actually, I don't know him, and I don't really know local. Oh, interesting. Oh. Donald Gray. I'm sorry, Donald Gray as a landscape designer. I'm not familiar with him. Designed Martin Luther King Drive. Oh.
He also designed Don Carpenter.
Okay.
There's a huge archive of Donald Gray's, all his papers from his business were donated by his family to the Western Reserve Historical Society. And they have a huge archive of like every piece of paper that came through. He was an amazing documentarian of his own life. And so if you're really interested, you'll be in heaven down there taking a look at this. It's boxes and boxes and boxes of papers and drawings.
Glad to have you help us organize. Oh, that might be fun.
Thanks. I'm not familiar with him. Someone I should obviously incorporate into this presentation. Yes.
I didn't quite get the contrast that you made between the English arts and crafts and the American arts and crafts. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the early American arts and crafts, which I assume was the English, and how it progressed through that period.
Well, a lot of themes I talked about in Britain really occurred in Britain before they did in America, and I separated out the Gertrude Jekyll style landscape, which in Britain is considered a craftsman style, an arts and crafts style, simply because it's, I don't think it's really what we think of as an arts and crafts style here. When we think of like the Craftsman bungalow, we're thinking more of landscape as might be influenced by Gustav Stickley and more American arts and crafts. The use of, like I said, pergolas and just really naturalistic landscape, whereas a Jekyll landscape is still very formal. They still had gravel paths, a lot of clipped hedges, but the plantings themselves are more the plantings themselves are more naturalistic. I just thought there's a little differentiation that is unique to Britain.
And then you talk about the integration between the exterior and the interior.
Right.
And with pots, I couldn't quite catch what you were saying.
Oh, okay. Well, as you know, in craftsman architecture, there's the use of casement windows, of open terraces, French doors, pergolas, so that the outside becomes, and the inside becomes sort of,
Easily accessible.
easily accessible, right. And in a lot of craftsman houses, I haven't seen it so much regionally, but you see a lot of masonry bungalows, arts and crafts bungalows, where the porch railing is actually masonry planters. I've seen that some regionally where the porch railing becomes a wooden planter. So just kind of using the landscape in a practical way that ties it in with the house.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned something about whether the landscape was to be seen from inside the house or from outside. So if you're thinking of it from inside the house, then you have like perimeter plantings.
Right. And that was really in regards to 19th century landscaping, is you don't have foundation planting. Typically, you have plantings that are more on the edge of the lawn rather than up against the house, so that you could see it from inside the house, or it's a screen between the public space and the private space. Thank you.
We're going to take a little breather here where we change from new technology to old technology. Vintage technology.
While we change projectors, I'd like to call your attention to two upcoming events that may be of interest. Next Wednesday, June 6th, Future Heights is sponsoring a public forum on residential development in Cleveland Heights. That will be held at 7 p.m. at the community center. And we've assembled a panel that represents leaders in the real estate, economic development, architecture, and planning fields who will discuss the development that has already occurred in our community, as well as some of the gaps. And we have designed the program so that there will be a lot of give and take between the panel and the audience. In fact, we're really going to devote most of the time to questions from the audience. So if you want to come and discuss that topic, it is next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Another event that we have coming up in the month of June is Sunday, June 24th. We occasionally sponsor members-only events, and we have one of those that afternoon. From 3 to 4:30, we will be taking a behind-the-scenes sneak peek of Gus and Jan Caius's straw bale house. And if you're from Cleveland Heights, you probably know what that is. If you're not from Cleveland Heights, you probably think I'm nuts. But you know that there's this house being constructed on Cedar Road using bales of straw. This is an old but very effective green building technique. It's going to be a phenomenally energy efficient house. And they have the structure in place, all the straw bales are in place, and they've just now started plastering those. And we'll be going on a tour led by the architect for the project, Chuck Miller, as well as one of the owners, Jan Caius. So mark that on your calendar as well. The date of the straw bale house is Sunday, June 24th, from 3 to 4:30. And you do need a reservation because we have a limit on how many people can go through the house. So you're welcome to call or email Future Heights. All of the information about this event will be posted on our website probably by the end of the week. Information about the Residential Development Forum is already on the website, and the website address is futureheights.org.
Before we welcome Ann, I also wanted to point out that there is information at the back of the room after the lecture, after we've had time to have questions with her. There's some information about Ann and her landscape business. There's also some brochures, I think, from the Historical Society that is co-sponsoring this. And then I think there may be some things from Future Heights sort of on tables here and there around. So we welcome you to kind of take things in. Yes, Chris? Oh, this Friday, for anyone who's interested, the Coventry School is having a end-of-the-year school play. I see our school librarian is here. And it's called Follow the Coventry Road. It's at 10 a.m. and at 7 p.m. And it should be quite entertaining. It's based on The Wizard of Oz, and every single Coventry child will be participating in the play. And there's a lot of tie-dye, and it's very colorful and exciting. So for anyone who's interested, as a PTA parent, we would welcome anyone to come and watch it. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Ann, and maybe Ann can tell you a little bit about herself and her business and how she got into that. She said I should keep it short and sweet. Let's see, get myself organized here.
Well, for those of you who would prefer to be at the Cavs game right now and getting prepared, I won't feel offended at all. You can try the back entrance. I don't think that works, but the front will not offend me at all. I can't promise that I'm going to be done in time, but I can either zip through this at top speed or I can take it slow. Take it slow. Yes. Okay. Well, firstly, hello everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Julie and Kara and all of you for inviting me here to speak tonight. It's really an honor and a privilege. Is my voice carrying okay? I'm not used to speaking in front of a microphone, but anyway. The slides I'm about to show you include befores and afters of various projects that I've been involved in. You'll see that if there are problem situations or problem areas in a garden or a landscape, there are always solutions. You'll see a selection of small to medium to large properties and how professional, creative landscape design has the potential to transform space. So we'll begin with slides that tell you a little about my background and then move on to some of the projects and then end with some of the landscapes and gardens that have inspired me over the years. Now, for those of you who happen to doze off during this presentation, there'll be a small esoteric quiz at the end. Only joking. If you do happen to doze off, there are some brochures, and you can always log on to my website, and quite a few of the photos and images you'll see on the screen are in the website, so please help yourselves. So we'll start off. When I close my eyes, I can often see the mountains of my childhood. There are places I often return to in my mind whenever I contemplate designing a garden for a client, like this spring-fed pool, one of many in a place called Retief's Kloof. See, is it sticking? No, I think it's going backwards. Oh, maybe I'm holding it upside down. Okay, sorry. That makes sense. I thought I'd throw in one of my prints because a lot of people don't know that I'm also an artist by background, and a lot of my work is obviously reflected, shows the African skies and colors. I was very lucky to grow up in South Africa. Rustenburg is a small town in the Magaliesberg Mountains. It's bushveld country and 80 miles away from Johannesburg. Blue skies, tall grasses, and wide open spaces. And 5 minutes from my home, I could climb the mountains that you just saw and see scenes like these, red-hot pokers, and this curious giraffe. South Africa has numerous tribes, each with their own customs and traditions. And here you see these Ndembele women and children in a little village with walls decorated and beautiful beadwork. So my brother John owns this incredible walking game farm. You can walk around it. It's one of the most unusual places, and it's situated right on top of the Soutpansberg Mountains, one of the few game reserves that is situated on top of a mountain. Way below, you can see the landing strip. And it's rather precarious. You have to come in to land on this very short strip and fly over and try to make sure there are no giraffe and rhino on the runway. You can stay in a lodge like this, which is a restored vendor village community, as it were. It's just a little village that's been restored by a very well-known African artist, Miriam Makeba. And she lives in a tin shanty below the mountain, but she has work in the Stedelijk Museum in Holland and various other museums. So she did all the sculptures. You can also lie in this incredible bath and look at the wonderful background, see animals on the plain below. Just more of the courtyard. And of course, you have these guys. And it's actually quite safe to walk around the farm. You just have to know if you're downwind or upwind, because rhino are rather blind and they can't really see very well. But as long as you're aware that they're there and they're aware of you, you're fine. Just as an offside comment, that my brother's grandchildren live on top of the mountain. The nearest civilization is an hour down the mountain by Land Rover, another hour into the nearest town. And sometimes the rhino can be in their driveway, so they have to go around the rhino, go up the mountain to go down the mountain. It's quite an incredible place for children to grow up. So many of my holidays were spent in the Cape, which is Mediterranean in climate. The botanical garden Kirstenbosch is situated against Table Mountain. You can often see king proteas if you walk along the mountains. I'm sure you've seen these. They often also grow them in California, but there's nothing like seeing them in the wild in Cape. This is a traditional Cape Dutch house, famous garden called Vergelegen. It also is a winery. Has a thatch roof and gable. Very simple architecture. Very informal garden, that. And this is a more contemporary garden with jasmine and grapes growing over the pergola. And this is one of my favorite beaches called Boulders Beach. And just literally around the corner, you'll find penguins. It's an amazing sight to see penguins swimming. And they've become a bit of a nuisance. They go up to these multi-billion-billion-dollar houses above the beach, and they tend to go into the bathrooms and then want to get into the toilets and the swimming pools. And for those of you who have seen, there was just recently, or about a year ago, there was some documentary, and I noticed this one very British woman swatting at a penguin with her broomstick and then noticing the camera and sort of saying, better not. This is, I don't know if that's in focus. Just Cape Point. Not the very, very tip of Africa, but pretty close. Sorry, I don't know why it's okay, Kara? I left South Africa at a time of turmoil and spent a number of years based in London and traveled all over Europe, France, Italy, just studying art, architecture, and gardens. This is Bodiam Castle, one of the few castles with a moat. It's functioning, and it's quite an amazing place. Just some of my work based on, this is a series on the castle theme. Just oils on canvas. And this is an intaglio or etching, just a view from my window in London. Very foggy and rainy and very atmospheric. So, my initial introduction to my future cottage in Cleveland Heights was in the Siberian winter of 1977. For those of you who remember it. I remember thinking that if any house could withstand this much snow, it had to have character. An obvious link to my love of Tudor architecture is found in the detail of this house. One often hears the phrase curb appeal. Obviously, the architectural characteristics of a house are important, but equally important is the landscape, which can either attract or detract from a house. And as a landscape designer, I believe that a garden is a statement of place, and that the best gardens are really entirely personalized spaces. In urban sites, space is limited. So how then does one create a welcoming atmosphere, a sense of intrigue in a garden? I decided to experiment and planted Carefree Beauty roses and Graham Thomas roses at the entry and painted the door blue, and many people have stopped and asked me what color blue it is, but actually I don't know because I concocted it. So after a load of leaf humus killed off my lawn in front, the public lawn, I actually had no clue what to do, and I took the opportunity of transforming this boring strip into an area that now includes spring bulbs and iceberg roses, lavender, poppies, and salvia. And actually, I've started a bit of a revolution, and I recognize some rather good supportive members in this audience, neighbors, who have all taken the opportunity to also try and transform their pieces. And my goal is, by the time I'm 95, to have everybody having no lawn. So I decided to use the dogwood as a focal point and built a barnstone wall to echo the stone detail in the chimney. And actually that slide is slightly, it's a little odd, but anyway, it's out of focus, or is it in focus? Okay. The garden is planted in an informal cottage garden style, using a wide range of trees, shrubs, and perennials to create an exuberant mix of colors and textures. But normally, you open the back door of a house, and what do you get? You get this incredibly boring strip of lawn, and you're usually looking into the neighbor's garden, and you think, oh my goodness, I just can't bear this. So what do? Back garden should be a place that you can really enjoy and relax in. So this is what I faced when I bought my house from the previous owners. Part of the garden was really interesting. The other part, as you can see in the foreground, was a bit of an agricultural plot with plastic, and I had no clue about growing vegetables. So it was, ergonomics or aesthetics, and aesthetics won. So the garden went through a lot of changes. My children, originally there was a sandbox, and then the children grew older and they wanted a swimming pool, and I couldn't afford a swimming pool, but I wanted a swimming pool. So we put the pond in for 2 days. We actually all dunked in and swam in it. And then I got some big koi, and I decided that wasn't so good. And one night I actually did fall into the pond. It was late at night in a storm, and I was worried that the fish were going to be catapulted out of the pond. Anyway, that's another story. So, the garden, to be a gardener, you have to be a little crazy, and you have to be rather persistent. And I had yet to decide which category I fitted into. But as I said, the garden has been phased in over time, and there are quite a few collections of plants. But a garden's not only about plants, it's really about structure. And you can see from a bird's eye view that it's just an enclosed, very personal, very intimate space. But plants are my passion, and I do have some interesting old antique roses, Madame Plantier, the white rose, and Mary roses, and English rose. And I do like native plants. I actually confess that I found this in North Chagrin, and I didn't realize you couldn't steal it. And this was many years ago, and I'm not proud of the fact, but I didn't do it again. Anyway, I was just fascinated by this plant and brought it back, and that must have been about 25 years ago, so I hope I'm forgiven. And this is a plant that's grown in South Africa, comes from South Africa, called Crocosmia. And by the way, for those people who hate orange, I think that's a pretty spectacular plant. Just hydrangeas. This is a Stewartia in autumn, just to show you the fall foliage, which I think is unbelievable in Cleveland. And of course, for 5 months a year, we look at winter. So often, I design backwards, and I often think that, there's nothing more beautiful than this lovely black hole, which is the pond, and the tracery of snow on the stonework. So it's important that a garden is built around a dominant idea. And structure and clear framework is very apparent in the transformation of this rear garden in Cleveland Heights. When I originally saw this Georgian house, I was very excited because I saw that slope. I thought, oh, great, a waterfall. I can do a waterfall. Well, the clients had very different ideas about what they wanted to achieve. And they'd been to Italy, on a trip to Italy. They'd noticed the piazzas and wanted a formal garden, and they told me that. So I did a series of drawings for them. And they were big entertainers. So I want you to look at this very carefully, and you'll see, of course, you saw this tear out and the mess, and then you're looking down on the garden. And you can see the process. It's really not a big garden, but you can see the terraces beginning to appear. And then that's the end result. So you can see from here, which is really exciting, great before picture. And that's the slope that I was excited about. And this is, for those people who have never really stayed home long enough to watch these guys building walls and digging trenches, it's really interesting to see it. It's just like sculpture, chiseling and putting these pieces of stone together. It's really wonderful. A lot of work. So this formal garden really demonstrates how significantly a design can mold a site to fit the client's needs. It's just before Christmas, I imagine, or hanging lights, or just after. So going on to this project, the role of a designer is to listen, problem solve, and also share an impression of possibilities in a garden that a client may not have considered. In this large country garden, it's on County Line in Russell, we were initially asked to redesign and rebuild the front walk only. And I state only because she was a friend of mine. We were walking our dogs around Shaker Lakes, and she'd moved from Cleveland Heights to County Line and said, oh, Anne, you might want to come help. I need this walk redone. So I said, oh, sure, we can do the walk, and, how about a garden in the front? And she said, oh, no, we never use the front door. I said, okay, that's not a problem, but how about a garden? And she said, oh, all right, let's see what you come up with. And it was fairly shady, so that's what we came up with. So I suggested creating an informal mixed border garden that would lead the visitor to the front door, and also along a stepstone path that you'll see in a minute to the right, leading to a large pond in the rear garden. So this existing concrete walk was removed, stone was put in, and the stepstone path you can see now is put in. Now, ironically, this started off as a shade garden, but wouldn't you know it, one of the trees upped and died on me, and so I had to change gears, and it became more of a sun garden. Creating plant combinations is really a very personalized process, and there are no fixed rules. These only make gardens formulaic and lifeless, so it's just pointless. And everybody who says there are rules is just nonsense, just tell them they're talking nonsense. because every gardener needs to develop their own vision, and this involves experimentation and taking risks and trying out new plants and plant combinations. So they also wanted a herb garden, and this was taken in winter. So I found the biggest bridgestone I could possibly find, and it looks rather small there, but it was pretty big. And this is the beginning of the herb garden. Very simple, millstone as a focal point. And then it begins to develop. I wanted to keep it, I like to design these gardens so they don't actually look designed, which is a real trick. Well, sometimes they don't look designed, so that's fine. But this just shows you lovely sweep of lawn, and those of you who like lawn, I'm not your designer, I guess. My goal is to remove lawn. But it just shows you the herb garden in progress. And for those, if the wedding of their oldest daughter took place in the front garden, and this was their middle daughter, whose wedding was just recently and took place in the back garden. And this is just looking over the pond at the tent and the wall that we constructed for the new terrace or patio. So, when asked what his favorite season is in a garden, an intrepid 80-year-old British gardener smiled and said, "Today." And in this garden, we're involved in a project of revitalizing the meadow and bog areas. Many American lawns can be reduced depending on the family's needs, and by restoring a meadow and encouraging native sedges and bog plants, we're encouraging a natural habit plant community of grasses and flowers, and that not only look wonderful, but also, encourage birds and butterflies. Those are all native plants. I didn't plant any of those. I just encouraged them to stop mowing. Well, now this one, does anybody recognize this house? Yeah, I can see Carol. This house is in the Chestnut Hills area in Cleveland Heights, and this is an amazing story, actually, and I'll be very brief. The original client called me many years ago, and she was a lovely lady, called me in, and she just wanted me to restore the garden according to the 1916 plans. And so I didn't really have much of an opportunity to really go at it, but we did the Japanese garden, which is behind the wall, and unfortunately she died several years later, so we never really had that opportunity to develop it even more than it was. But then, lo and behold, this owner moved in, and they called the Smiths, and the Smiths who on Fairmont recommended me, because all he wanted was to restore his fountain at the back. And again, that was all he wanted, but this was an opportunity I couldn't miss, and the before picture of this was great. So he's a gardener and he loves color, and the more plants, the better for him. And there's always a delicate balance between too many plants and too few. But I love the idea of using time as a sort of a symbol for a flowing river of color through this and the vertical elements. And just some of the irises. So the cobbled courtyard with the high stucco walls had very little of interest. The original owner was a bit of a modern sculpture buff, and she had all these crazy sculptures all over the place. Well, those all went. And so we designed something very classical, just lattice work and espaliered apples. And he loves to create these incredible plant combinations. So it really looks like a bit of Europe with a cobbled driveway. Thomas Church is quoted as saying, "Gardens are for people. The closer house and garden are in use and appearance, the more they begin to interlock. More and more, the lines and materials are carried outdoors and into the landscape, blurring the boundaries between the house and garden. I designed a stone terrace and water garden. So if you go from this, which had a little formal rose garden, to this, it really is quite a transformation. And it's a very small terrace, very intimate, but two large rectilinear ponds, one flows into the other. The lower pond has very large koi, and the top pond has lilies and Victoriana. The house was originally built around a Skinner organ, for those of you who have not had an opportunity to tour this house. And it was designed by Howland Thomas. But the Skinner organ is the sister organ to the Severance organ, and there's nothing like it. When we were building the project, the owners used to open up the windows and doors, and it was great. We'd hear this incredible music as we were designing and playing around in the dirt. She's a professional musician, so she also has a room dedicated to harpsichords. But this just shows all the kind of work that goes into building a garden. See the ponds. It's lovely to be able to just look out the window and see this beautiful water right close by. Just more views. Cutting garden. More cutting garden. In that little tiny greenhouse, he starts his seeds in January or February, and this is what he produces. It's unbelievable. And that little Japanese garden you saw from the street, this is just a slide with a little bridge over. It's changed a bit. But we have the owners of Bolu in the audience, and I'd like to introduce them. Sally and Ted Smith sitting in, you may as well stand up and take the bows. They heard I was speaking and couldn't they had to come to make sure that I wasn't going to say any lies and talk nonsense about the garden. But I must say this was an unbelievable opportunity, and just very briefly, I managed to get this job through, well, I think Sally and Ted have more confidence than I did in myself, but our daughters went to school together. And my daughter came home one day and said, "Mom, you know that house you've always loved on the corner, I know the people who've just moved into it, and, you really ought to write to them." And I said, "Oh, no, I can't do that." She said, "Well, if you don't, I will." So I said, "Oh, no, don't do that." So I wrote Sally a little note, I think, of saying, if you want any weeding done or if you want any kind of work done, I'd really like an opportunity. Next day, she called me over and said, "Okay, well, how would you like to work with somebody who has very fixed ideas and strong opinions?" I said, "Absolutely fantastic." And so both of them have been really my friends and wonderful clients. Anyway, the psychology of arrival is very important. Nothing justifies making an obstacle course from the car to the front door. And this was made very clear in this project. I was asked to design the garden at Bolu, and it's French for beautiful place, in 1996. The house was originally designed by the architect Frederick Striebinger and built for Henry Tremaine in 1912 to 1914. Bolu is registered as a historic landmark, and it's also an excellent example of the Beaux-Arts style. Essentially, it's a large formal garden, and it's clearly divided into linked garden areas with distinctive atmospheres, enclosing structured and varied planting. But I want you to notice this before picture very carefully, because there were these scruffy pines on the outside, and Sally, Ted, and I decided they ought to come down. They were diseased, and some neighbors really objected, but you'll see why we had to do it later. This is really Cinderella coming out of going to the ball and coming home. Notice the barberry hedges. And so we have that. The roses have changed a bit. We've got white roses now, but basically a driveway had to be incorporated because nobody ever used this front door. And they insisted, and they said, we've got to be able to do it. So I originally looked at some of the plans, and they looked more like a hotel drive-around circle, and I thought, well, that's fine if you have Rolls Royces and Bentleys, but if you have, and I won't mention any other alternative cars, but you can imagine it would look really bad. So we try to play down the driveway. This is a before picture showing you the barberry hedge. And the biggest compliment to them and to myself was when people who are out from out of town who don't know this house will often walk by and say, in fact, a gentleman from New York, many years after we built it, said, "Oh, that's incredible," and he didn't realize the balustrade had never been there, that we designed it and built it. This is the sandstone fountain again. It really adds to the entrance. But the sphinxes had to be moved back. I'll just go back to that. The sphinxes had to be moved back in order to incorporate the driveway, and we had to protect the large oaks. So there was a lot of maneuvering. Well, drainage was an important consideration. And during the construction, the site was flooded in heavy rainfall and resembled a moat or a canal. And the story goes that, I don't know if Ted wants to tell the story, but apparently he leaned out the window one morning and said to Sally, "Well, you've always wanted to live in Venice, and here you have." So building a garden often takes on the appearance of a demolition site. Now, I want you to notice this very shapeless mound in the foreground. And this is what it becomes. The curved sandstone wall was designed to visually define a raised area and create an informal bed for spring bulbs and perennials. So the success of a landscape design really depends on these four principles: unity, function, simplicity, and scale. And this house really put those elements to the test. And this is a great before picture. This kitchen entry had to be redesigned. It had outdated foundation planting of taxus and an existing concrete walk and very ugly asphalt driveway, totally in disrepair. The area sloped down from the house to the driveway. So you can see now what used to exist, just a tiny little patio with irregular stone and the sloping lawn, and going out you can see Fairmount in the background. So we elevated the whole area because we were able to do that, but using the stone wall. And this is looking towards the herb garden. Got rid of the ugly asphalt driveway, put in some cobble, lavender hedge, and voila, you have a bit of a garden. And this slide shows looking back towards the French garden. This is where I nearly had a heart attack, but never mind. This was the beginning of the herb garden. Sally had said to me she wanted a herb garden that resembled Villandre, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I'd seen pictures of it, and she showed me pictures, and I said, "Well, Sal, that's great, but this is not a very large area." So we designed a herb garden, and this is the process of putting the footers in for the balustrade. And at this very point, I said, "Oh my goodness, I think I've done this too small." And the guys just said, "Onwards." So that's the development of the herb garden. And designs often on paper, when I originally drew the little water feature, it looked like a horse trough. So I quickly repainted it just before they started digging. It's just one does have to make some changes, and it's not always perfect. This is a spring shot of the herb garden and an autumn picture. And of course, looking towards the side of the house again, the west side, you can see now the taxus have been removed. And that's just another picture of the walk leading up to the herb garden and the balustrade. And this is again looking at the snow, which I think is so important. Sally is an art historian. She is incredibly knowledgeable about everything and anything, and so is Ted. He said he wasn't a detail man, but he was wrong, or I've certainly found out later. But this is certainly something after her own heart, and she lectures on Shakespeare and the symbolism in Shakespearean gardens. So those of you who haven't heard it, it's well worth it. But all the plants in this garden are mentioned somewhere in Shakespeare's works, and she's drawn up quotations. So there's hemlock and thyme and marigold and a Juliet rose. So changes in garden design during the last few decades have been enormous. A garden was generally designed to provide a long vista from some spot within the house. It was a place to be looked at rather than a place to be lived in. A garden should be designed to extend the living space. And this is a great before picture. Now, I cannot take any kind of praise for the black bottom pool. That was definitely Ted Smith's idea, because originally this was a reflecting pool, and it's a fantastic experience to swim in this pool or just be in this garden and see the reflections of the oaks. It just worked beautifully rather than a Mediterranean sort of turquoise color. Really fit the house. But it was very shabby before and surrounded by overgrown shrubs and that rusty old chain-link fence and crumbling concrete walls, and now you have stonework and wrought iron. Really works well with the architecture. And a matching border. I'll just go through these at a rapid rate. So here I got to use quite a few English roses. And this is looking towards the French garden with the overgrown shrubs and starting the boxwoods in. And now you can open up the views and see the carriage house. And even the autumn pictures are pretty interesting. Shows you more of the reflections. This area is designated as the French garden. It was also neglected, and this is already in progress of cleaning up. We've cleared out a lot of junk. We had a deadline for the Smith's oldest daughter's wedding. It seems like I'm always designing for weddings. And in August 1998, and you can see how plans are forging ahead to install the third pond. There were bets on in the neighborhood as to whether we would complete the project in time. And actually, I've never seen so many husbands walking around the block. In fact, many people would put their deck chairs and chairs out at the entrances just to see and criticize, and comment on the work. Now, there are 673 boxwoods in this garden. And I know that because when I ordered them, and I ordered them for a specific delivery date, when I phoned to just check they were being delivered, they said they'd sold them all to someone else. Well, I had become American enough to hold my breath and do my yoga counting, and then said, I'll sue you if you don't get them back. So they did. And we now have a fountain in the middle of that pond. This is just an earlier picture, and everything's grown a lot more. But it's difficult to imagine that this garden once looked like this, and now we have this view. And I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I still have one more carousel, but I promise you I'll go faster. How am I doing? And if anybody wants to leave, they're welcome to leave. I mean, don't leave, but I mean, it's fine. Otherwise, I'll forge ahead. What's the time now? Okay, I'll move it. The Cavs game starts in? Okay. So this is, more than any other element in garden design, it's access, the way we move into, about, and through a garden, and that most describes the landscape designer's personal vision of nature. When we consider access in the garden, we are concerned primarily with walks and paths. And they can be obvious, straight or gently curved, leading without confusion to the front door, or meander to an important feature on the property, such as this pond or lake. The paths may be broad and level or terraced into gentle steps. Now, these are slides that are not designed, these gardens are not designed by me, but by fellow designers and other gardens and landscapes that have inspired me. And they're in Cleveland, Philadelphia, England, South Africa, all over the place. But this just shows you, coming from that, this is in Bracknell, for those of you who are interested. Beautiful pond, and then you come to this formal terrace, and it's very sunny, into this lovely curved terrace. And then you get into something that's almost tropical. You'd swear you were in Florida, or even better than Florida. I mean, I've never seen coleus look like this, and banana plants just in cannas. This is in Bracknell. Bracknell. Those of you who don't understand my accent, well, I'll have to spell it for you later. Now, some people have said to me, well, gee, how do they get those banana plants to grow in Cleveland? And actually, there is a banana plant that can be grown, so Bill Hendricks at Klein Nursery assures me. He's had his in his garden for several winters. But these are taken out every year and put into a greenhouse. But you can see how this forces you to walk down this narrow little lawn strip, but it really, you get a real feel for the scale, the change of scale in plants. This is a garden in South Africa, just showing how you could have a path that actually climbs a mountain and have these wonderful aloes and succulents and native plants spilling down the mountain. It's another garden I consulted on in South Africa with this lovely dovecote. This guy is absolutely crazy. I mean, there are crazy gardeners, but this one seriously, he and his wife have built this garden into the mountain. I don't have time to show you the whole garden, but he's actually built a chapel recently. So now he has weddings in the garden, and the chapel is, he imported a craftsman who did all the woodwork from Poland. It was unbelievable. And he has Roman columns, and this is a garden, Chanticleer. Those of you who've been to Philadelphia, famous garden, really magnificent, very formal terraces. It's just some interesting architecture, and I took these pictures because of the topiary. If you can see those containers, very interesting, very sculptural. And this feeling of very simple chartreuse and green. These are small water containers. But this is really what I took these pictures in Chanticleer. I love the idea of, I will give them this. If you're going to have a lawn, you can actually let part of it go wild, and then, especially if you live in the country, and mow the rest of it. And it has this lovely contrast in textures. And the chairs behind are actually sculptures, but you can sit on them, and it's very relaxing. This actually is a work shed, but it's the most gorgeous work shed I've ever seen. Lovely ponds. Now this is, we can't possibly leave the world of garden design without hitting England. And who has not been to England? Well, you have to save those bucks, because really, it's really amazing. August, okay, that's good. Glance at this thatched cottage with climbing roses in a small village tells us all we have to know about the principle of simplicity. It's a garden in Highgate, London. It guides the visitor up these steps, softened by campanula and ivy, into a sun area, then only to turn back, and you just find this nook in the shade. And what a surprise when we see this formal hedge and statue. This is a very famous garden called Great Dixter. Has anybody seen this garden? It's designed by Christopher Lloyd, and he died recently, but he is a gardener, just an unbelievable gardener. And this is a garden where there are no rules. He puts pink and yellow and red and orange next to each other and purple, and it looks phenomenal. Just a beautiful, dazzling display. Obviously, they can grow hedges like we can't, but the contrast to these green, beautiful ribs of framework hedges and the lovely plant combinations. And you can see the pink and the orange, bit of orange. My other goal in Cleveland is to convert every Clevelander to acknowledge that orange is a color. And not only is it a color, but they actually wouldn't mind trying it in their gardens. Now I'm just whisking through these. This is my mother who I treated to. She met us in England and she's now turned 90, but I needed her to show the scale of some of these gardens. And you can tell she's having a great time trying to capture that special shot. Now, this is a garden called Nyman's, which is another garden in Sussex. We just concentrate on the Sussex area, and you can see these wonderful rose gardens. And this is a private garden called Bramdean. And this is where you see a formal English border to perfection, just matching borders. You can see the focal point way in the distance, that turquoise door, also a tool shed, but what a tool shed. And it doesn't, it certainly helps to have old stone walls that are hundreds of years old. And this is the quintessential sort of English shot of swans. And this is a garden called Mottisfont Abbey, also these incredibly huge oaks and beautiful trees. I was lucky enough to see all of David Austin's roses. He designed this garden, and I arrived in June to take these pictures, and I was delirious. It was unbelievable. So I whisked around as fast as I could, trying to take photos. But this is the famous Graham Thomas rose. And you can see that, what I really loved about this trip was the fact that whenever I went touring, you saw people really sitting in these gardens and enjoying them. And the British people have a knack. They have tea time at 8 in the morning and 10 o'clock in the morning and 12 and 2 and 3 and 4. It's a wonder they get any work done. But somehow they seem to enjoy life. Although this poor chap had been waiting for his wife for ages, and he confessed that all he wanted to do was go and watch Liverpool play football and have a drink in the pub. And this is Sissinghurst Castle. It's designed by Vita Sackville-West and her husband Nigel Nicholson, and this is a magnificent garden, cleverly designed to create different rooms, each with its theme of color and texture and structure. By the way, her designing room or library is right at the top of the tower. And you'll see later on, I'll show you a top view of the garden. But this is the cutting garden. More pictures of the cutting garden. The rose garden. This really indicates the room idea that everybody has. This is the rondel. All it is a simple circular lawn surrounded by a circular hedge. Peach lime walk. And this is the view that you can see, these rooms. How anyone could have this kind of vision is just incredible. This is the purple border. These lovely old benches. And you can see these architectonic plants. They almost look thistle-like. But then, you could squeeze down this narrow alleyway. And the contrast of the formal border and the meadow is quite wonderful. show a bit of the English countryside. It's all part, and this is a thyme garden, just a bed of thyme, very simple statement. And this is the famous white garden, which has only got whites and silvers and cream in this whole garden. And at twilight, I waited for 5 hours until I could see this garden at twilight, and it's really miraculous. A rose, climbing rose. It's a rambler rose. But, you know, England's known for its roses, so... Well, we're getting to the end. I can assure you, those people who are watching their watches very carefully. You know, gardens are potentially very, very powerful places. This was a shot taken actually in Southern California when I was there in, I'm trying to think when I was there, March. Combining freedom of expression with the discipline of good design is the surest route to providing your garden with a unique quality. And to weigh, advise, interpret, integrate, and come up with answers beyond the ability and imagination of the layman is the role of a landscape designer. These are just some of the couple of the California gardens that took my fancy. Santa Barbara. And this is a garden in Chicago, Millennium Park. Those of you who have never been there in autumn, it's really worth a visit, because these ornamental grasses are unbelievable. They just come into their glory, and with all the steel and concrete around it, and this lovely frothy mix of color, and the grasses wave in the wind. It's really magnificent. So those of you who are wondering what I'm up to these days, in February I spent a month working in the Virgin Islands, and I was working for a landscape company, and this was us going out by boat and barge. It's great fun. They made me climb on the boat while it was on land, thank goodness, and then the guys climb on or jump on, and the equipment's all put on, and the plants are all put on the barge, and you go off to different islands. And this is going to Necker Island, which is Richard Branson's island. Those of you who have heard of Richard Branson, the CEO of Virgin Atlantic. So I was incredibly delighted to be able to see his island. I'd heard so much about it. And this is where you wait for your boat. It's all done in Bali style, and for a cool $40,000 a day, you know, you can also have the helicopter. But this is the pagoda that you see from a distance. It's just some of the interiors looking out, very exotic, magnificently, beautifully, tastefully done. This was the hillside that I was working on and designing and helping. It was mostly bougainvillea and local indigenous plants. It was really a disaster before we started it, and the humidity factor was quite unbelievable. But just showing you some more views. And I love this. This is one of many pools that you can swim in. And for those of you who want to go on honeymoon or can afford it, this is taken from the honeymoon suite. And way down below is an open shower and bathroom where there's no boats can come past because there's a reef. So it's absolutely magnificent. I don't have time to show it to you, but anyway. So for those of you who are lucky enough to own a dovecote or a century-old thatched cottage or even a small castle, you definitely have your work cut out. You could also own a lovely house that looks like Tuscany in the mountains, or you might have a baobab in your back garden. There's time to remember why we have gardens, to relax in and contemplate beauty. And those of us who lead lowly lives must make do with our children who guide us towards simple pleasures in gardens. And if not for our gardens, then at least our trusty helpers. And as Vita Sackville-West once said, no gardener would be a gardener if he did not live in hope. This slide shows a bunch of friends and clients who I took on a tour to South Africa last year, We're in a Land Rover going around one of the reserves near Kruger Park. And on the way to seeing some animals, our ranger John jumped out. He knew we were all plant fundies, and he knew that Bill Hendricks of Klein Nursery was a know-it-all and knew everything that there was possibly to know about every succulent. So he jumped out and dug this up and said, I'll give anybody who knows the name of this plant $20. So of course we thought and thought and thought, and nobody could guess. And he finally said, this is the local man's Viagra. So we called this bulb bulbus erectus. And this might have, in fact, inspired this garden in England. Thanks very much. Does anybody have any questions? Well, I guess I've silenced all of you.
This way they'll pay attention to you.
Yeah, that's good. Otherwise, the Cavs game is on, so yes.
Right here. Something about the principles you worked from.
You know, there's so many principles, but structure, unity, you know, a whole lot of them, and I just brought out a few of them. As I said, one can go on and on about design and design. Is another one. Time is another. Accident is another. Chance is another. Anyone else have any questions? Great. Yes.
When you design, for example, in the lands and the island,
Yes.
did you have to do a lot of research for land flight, or did you pretty
Well,
much know?
yeah, in the Virgin Islands, it was a totally different plant palette. And although I come from South Africa, this was more related to Durban, which is on the higher ups, closer to the equator. And the plants were, I mean, I never knew there were so many palms in my life. I mean, I had to study them, and it was sort of a joke because he threw me into the deep end and said, okay, Anne, go and design this garden. And he set me up in a four-wheel drive. Let's see, it was a Mazda. It was left-hand drive, but the steering wheel was on the left side as well. And I had to transport 5 guys in the back of the truck, and also do four-wheel drive stick shift. So it was fun going up 90-degree angles, and then, you know, but you'd really see a totally different plant palette. And I did study at night. I'd take home books, and he just gave me quite a number of gardens to design, and it was really fun to do that because it was totally new for me. Anyone else? Well, you're all being very kind and patient, so back to the case. Thanks.